Hi guys, this is Margaret.
And I'm Kristianna.
In this short video, we will be talking about the treatment of Indigenous people in Australia during the 1960s.
How it's related to Jasper Jones and the position we are in today.
So guys, let's talk first about the police discrimination. Police discrimination and harassment of Aboriginal in the 1960s was not new. Historically, police and Aboriginal relationships have been notoriously bad. Throughout the decade, the Aboriginal and police relations were characterized by a high degree of police supervision and scrutiny of Aboriginal life and lifestyles. Since the turn of the century, the police had been on the cutting edge of controlling and suppressing Aboriginals with strong legal powers, which were often overstepped. Not only were Aboriginals arrested at a significantly higher rate than non-Aboriginals, they were arrested for a very limited range of offences, almost exclusively of public order offences. From the known rates of arrest and recorded experiences of Aboriginals, it is evident that in the 1960s, policing was a serious problem for Aboriginal and Aboriginal communities. But wait, Kristianna, how are these disrespectful lacquer shown in the novel Jasper Jones?
In relation to the novel Jasper Jones, which is set in the 1960s, this type of discrimination isn't uncommon. A week after Laura's disappearance, search planes have gone and dive teams have surfaced empty-handed. But Jasper Jones is brutalised by police who brought him in and detained him for the whole weekend. Within the novel, Charlie asks Jasper what happened to his face. Jasper explains to Charlie that police brought him in with no reason to do so, as well as explaining to him that he had been hit all over as well as in the ribs with steel-capped shoes. Jasper himself describes this act as brutal. The fact that police are able to detain and brutalise a child simply because he's known as a suspicious character within a community just shows how backwards police and government law is.
Well guys, let's have a look at what's happening in the world today. Aboriginal Australians have a long history of mistreatment at the hands of authorities. George Floyd's death brought back painful memories for the family members of some Aboriginal victims. We know the pain that Black America is feeling in the wake of George Floyd's death, because we feel it too. The Aboriginal family members said in a statement, "We live in a constant fear that we're going to be abused and harassed by police, and the police get away with it. It's normalized, and that's wrong. We shouldn't have to live like that." Aboriginal deaths at the hands of law enforcement are a charged issue in Australia. The deaths highlights with oppressive policing and high levels of imprisonment. More generally, they are markers of institutional brutality within Australian society.
Now, let's talk about rights in Australia. Indigenous people didn't have the same rights as other Australians as they faced a lot of discrimination. They weren't even counted as citizens in their own country, so they started demanding equality. In 1962, all Indigenous were given the right to enrol to vote in federal elections like all other Australians. In 1965, Indigenous workers stood up against unfair working conditions and land rights. In the same year, uni students protested racism and poor living conditions in Australia. This was known as the Freedom Ride, which was a 15-day bus journey through regional New South Wales. Around the same time, New South Wales activists set big goals wanting to change sections of the country's constitution that was discriminated. To change the constitution, there had to be a referendum. To get the government to hold this referendum for Indigenous rights, campaigners had to get signatures on a petition. Eventually, after 10 years of campaigning, they collected 100,000 signatures and finally got the vote. On the 27th of May 1967, more than 90% of Australian voters chose yes to count Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the census for Indigenous people to be subject to Commonwealth laws, rather than just state laws. In this time, people were still pushing to change the constitution, as it did not recognise Indigenous Australians as the nation's first people, as well as allowing the government to make laws which discriminated against race. I'm sure Marga is able to explain how Aboriginal rights are represented in Jasper Jones.
Yes, Kristianna. Well, rights in relation to Jasper Jones has come across many times in the novel. We encounter many disrespectful comments and discrimination towards Jasper Jones. Before and though part of the 1960 discrimination was constantly pushed towards Aboriginal or anyone who has Indigenous descent, or known as half-caste. As shown in the novel, when Jasper was detained in prison for the weekend and Laura's father came to the station and was described as being more brutal than the police, including skimming as well as spitting, which shows next level of disrespect. Throughout the 1960s, this discrimination, including blaming Jasper Jones for every crime in Corrigan and rude actions toward Aboriginals. It is because of acts like this that these activists work so hard and set big goals to change the parts of the Constitution that were discriminated.
Let's talk about Aboriginal rights today. There are 476 million Indigenous people in the world, and there are common issues that affect Indigenous people globally. Although Indigenous people have the right to live in freedom, peace and security, as well as having the rights to practice their cultural positions, due to remaining effects of colonisation and abuse, Indigenous people are vulnerable to discrimination and mistreatment, which affects their rights, causing Indigenous people to be more likely to live in poverty, with poor health and restrictions, which affects their self-determination. Over the years, many started to recognise the risks faced towards Indigenous people. So in 2007, the United Nations passed the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People to help eliminate human rights violations placed against them. On the 13th of February 2013, the Federal Parliament passed an Act of Recognition which formally recognised Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander people as the nation's first, meaning they were in Australia before white settlement. Within the 1960s, the treatment of Indigenous Australians has been brutal and unfair. These acts of disrespect and discrimination have strongly been portrayed throughout the novel Jasper Jones. And although the brutality, segregation and rights of Aboriginals has improved since the 1960s, there is still a separation between Aboriginals and non-Aboriginals today.
So that's about it, guys. Thank you for viewing our vlog.
And we'll see you next time.